how I returned to wood turning after being away from it for a long time, and how my experience can help you. All that and more, including lathe choice and necessary tools, coming up. Hi there and welcome to WB Fun Woodworking. I'm Don. This video is a remake of a video that I did on my Nova Comet II lathe. I've added a few things that weren't in the previous video, and because of a lot of your comments, I took out the background music that some of you found was very irritating. I'm sure you'll like that. I've been working with wood for as long as I can remember. When I was a kid, my dad always had a shop, either in the basement or in a garage. He taught me a lot of different things, and one of the things that he taught me was how to turn wood on a lathe. Well, we had a shopsmith, but that was similar. Back then, all we had was traditional tools to turn with, so that's what I learned on. That was almost 50 years ago. And I really haven't turned since. So recently I decided that I wanted to get back into turning, so I bought myself a lathe. In this video, I'll be covering the Nova Comet II lathe, why I picked it, what I like about it, a few things that I don't like about it, some of the tools I've used, and what you might need to get started. I thoroughly researched all the lathes that are available today. I looked at listings on Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, and even checked estate sales within 200 miles of my house, but couldn't find a good used lathe. As a result, I decided to buy a Nova Comet II lathe, and I'm very happy that I did. The package that I bought was one that they were offering that included the G3 chuck and some small turning tools. I checked all the prices online, and CPO outlets seemed to have the best deal, so I ordered one from them. It was delivered to our front gate right next to my workshop, so I used my dolly and moved it right into my garage. I pulled out the box that had the lathe in it, and my wife helped me put it on top of my assembly table. One of the first things that I pulled out of the box was the directions. They are important for putting this lathe together. I continued to pull out all the parts from the packaging and unwrapped the lathe. I could now see what parts were missing that I had to put onto the lathe. I unwrapped all the parts and laid them out on the table in front of the lathe. According to the instructions, the feet needed to be put on first, so I followed the instructions and the procedure that they showed and put on the feet. That left just a few more things to be put on the lathe. The first of those was the spindle lock for the tailstock. It has to be lined up so that the locking part goes into this groove on the tailstock. Next is the knob for the tailstock handle. It's just screwed on. After that, I added the tool rest to the banjo. And the last piece is the headstock hand wheel, which just screws on. According to the instructions, it is very important to allow between 30 and 45 minutes of runtime on the brushes of the motor before turning or putting a significant load on the motor. So I followed the directions and let the motor run with no load on it for at least 45 minutes. I was very surprised and pleased at how quiet the motor is. The Nova Comet II does come with a drive center. This is the drive center that it comes with. It's a 4-prong drive center, very common in the industry. It's what I used many years ago, but some people don't like that because it doesn't seem to grab onto the work as well as some of the others. I've taken the recommendation of many others, and I've replaced that drive center with one that has a lot of teeth here, and it seems to bite into the work better. This little point, by the way, on both of them goes into the center of whatever you're turning. This is the live center that comes with the Nova Comet II. it goes in the tailstock. The live center has a bearing that it turns on as the piece turns on the lathe. Again, the point here goes into the center of what's being turned. It's a nice live center. It's very good quality, good piece of equipment. This section here, though, is rather large. It's wide. And so a narrow piece would be difficult to turn on using this live center. I discovered another problem with this live center when I drilled the hole for my ice cream scoop handles before I turned them on the lathe. There's no way for this live center to hold that in place. It would slide around. So I had to exchange this one out. I switched it out to one that looks like this. Now the hole in the end of the scoop handle fits right over the point of the live center. And yes, this one has a bearing on it just like the other one does. When I drilled the holes in the ice cream scoop handles, I decided to use the lathe rather than my drill press, because at the time my drill press was not working correctly. So I bought a drill chuck for the lathe. I can set it into the tailstock here, and this chuck works just like a drill press chuck. It has a key that tightens and loosens it. These chucks are really nice, very handy to have. One word of caution: when you buy a chuck or any other tool that goes in the headstock or the tailstock, both the tailstock and the headstock have what's called a Morse taper, and it's the number 2 Morse taper. There's more than one Morse taper, so you need to make sure you get the ones that are the number 2, and that then fits into the tailstock or the headstock. The lathe also comes with a faceplate that can be used for turning bowls and other large objects. This is the Nova G3 chuck that I got with the package when I bought my lathe. It's an excellent chuck and highly rated. In fact, I've seen many people use them on other brands of lathes. One of the nice features of these Nova chucks is how they're adjusted. We use a chuck key very similar to what you would use on a drill press. That gets inserted in the slot here and turned. And as it turned this way, clockwise, the jaws are expanding, as you may notice there. And to turn the other way, the chuck jaws contract. Now you can see here the limit that we have to the chuck. I had it all the way out to the biggest it could get, and this is the smallest that it can get. Another great thing about this chuck is there are a lot of different jaws that you can get for this chuck. You can get one small enough to turn pins, and you can get larger ones to turn something like a platter. But again, on this lathe, you're limited to the space between the middle of the spindle and the ways. So you're limited there in how big of an item you can turn. Changing jaws on one of these Nova chucks is fairly easy, but it does take time and effort. First of all, it would be best to take the chuck off of the lathe and not try to do it on the lathe. But each of these screws, all 8 of these screws, have to be removed, and as 2 are removed, one jaw comes off. Then once all the jaws are off, you can start putting the new jaws on. And each jaw and each section on the chuck is numbered. For example, this is number 4. So this is jaw number 4 that goes in this spot. So you'd match up all of the jaws starting with 1, put the jaw on, put the 2 screws in, and so forth until all the new jaws are put on the chuck. Then the chuck should be put back on the lathe. This chuck also comes with a worm screw for turning large bowls. If I had a bowl that was fairly deep here, I could put the worm screw into the bowl blank and turn the outside of the bowl, and then turn it around and put it in the chuck and turn the inside of the bowl. So the worm screw comes with the chuck. What was interesting to me is that the lathe came with this bar. It's only mentioned in one of the lists of materials, and nowhere in the directions does it say how to use it. In that materials list, they did call it an OP bar, but that was it. What most people call this bar is a knockout bar. Let's say that this live center is stuck and won't come out. The bar is then inserted into the back of the tailstock and is pushed forward, and the live center comes out. Now, to do this, make sure you have a good hold on the live center or it will go flying. Don't ask me how I know. The bar also works with the headstock. If this drive center was stuck, the bar could be inserted in the headstock and pushed until the drive center comes out. One of the things that I really liked about this Nova Comet II lathe is this electronic speed control. I'll turn the lathe on. You can hear it's running at a low speed. Now I'll increase the speed. You can hear it's running at a higher speed. Now I'll turn that down. So I can adjust it to anything in that spectrum. It's color-coded. The yellow speeds are the lowest speeds, the middle speeds are the orange, and the high speeds are the red. Those three divisions on the electronic variable speed control are related to the three pulleys that are in the headstock of the lathe. The large pulley is for things like bowls. That's the slow speed. The middle one is the one I use most of the time. It's mainly for spindle work. And then the small one is a high speed, and that's used for things like pins. The pulleys in the headstock have corresponding pulleys below. In order for the belts to be moved from one set of pulleys to the other, first this black handle has to be used to loosen a bolt. Once the bolt is loose, this red handle can be used to raise up the motor and put slack into the belt. Now the belt can be moved to the other pulleys. Then the handle has to be pushed down as tight as it can be, and the black handle has to tighten the bolt. In the headstock, you may have noticed next to the pulleys there is a section with some slots in it, and they're numbered. These slots are connected with a pin that's on the back of the headstock. The pin is connected to a wheel that can be turned to unlock or lock the spindle. Before you'd ever turn on the lathe, make sure it's in the unlocked position. These slots are for indexing the spindle. On the Nova lathe, there are 12 of them. There's not enough time or space in this video to explain indexing. That's something you might want to research on your own. But it is a feature that's built into the Nova Comet II lathe. As I mentioned earlier, the lathe came with a mini chisel set. After opening the box and looking at the chisels, I wasn't sure how handy they would be. They were so small compared to the chisels that I was used to. I also bought a set of Benjamin's Best chisels. I really don't need all of the chisels at this point to get started, but I decided to go ahead and get this set anyway. As I'll show you later, I could have gotten started with just 3, maybe 4 chisels. This is where I could have been a little wiser in my use of money at the beginning. I tried to research chisels at the beginning, and I probably could have done it much better than this set. You may have noticed that I turned to traditional turning tools to get started. That's partly because that's what I was used to before. I also like them because they are easy to use, but they do require sharpening. I've even noticed with my roughing gouge here, it's a little crooked here, a little cattywampus there. I need to get back and sharpen that and straighten it out. I tried to hand sharpen it, and I didn't do a great job on getting it straight across. Sharpening is a big deal when it comes to traditional tools, though. I tried to do it with hand sharpening and turned out that I was better off getting a Wolverine jig. So I added a Wolverine jig to my sharpening system, and I switched from a regular composite grinding wheel to a CBN wheel. They don't heat up the steel nearly as much as a composite wheel does. They're also much easier to use. This is my current grinding setup. The motor is a Delta multiple speed motor. It does have a low speed on it. It's not quite as low as the speed that's on the low speed grinders that are out there. And I would suggest one of those over this. I didn't know that I was going to be turning when I bought this, but it does have pretty low speed. On this side, I have a regular composite wheel that came with the grinder. I've used that. In fact, the other day I had to modify a wrench, so I've used that for metal work. Over here is the CBN wheel, and this is wonderful. These wheels do not have to be flattened. They stay flattened. They really sharpen well, and they don't get hot like regular wheels do. If I'm using this wheel, the steel gets very hot very quickly. Over here, the steel does not get as hot. This little table piece is for part of my Wolverine jig, and it's used for things like a Skew Chisel and some of the other tools I can sharpen on this, as well as bench chisels. I have another piece that goes in for my spindle gouge and bowl gouges and some of the other gouges that I have. This is the Wolverine sharpening jig. I have it actually on both sides, but I just use it on the CBN wheel for right now. To do my chisels for the lathe, I have to take this table off. Unlock it, pull it out, take the long arm, put it in, and I'll put it into about there and lock it down. Now it's ready for the roughing gouge, and that gets turned on the CBN wheel. Turning tools like bowl gouges and spindle gouges are turned on this fixture. And to do that, this will have to be realigned. So loosen it. Right now I have the tape at the right spot, so I can move that in, lock it up, and then this piece here goes in the back, and now it's ready to turn the spindle gouge or the bowl gouge. No, I'm not going to show you my techniques for sharpening turning tools. There are a lot of videos on YouTube already from some real seasoned turners, and I'd suggest you look for some of those. I'm still learning, so my technique is not what you want to see. To get started on spindle turning, the first tool that you'll need is a roughing gouge. Here I'm using a roughing gouge to turn a square piece of wood round. A roughing gouge does this very quickly, as you can see in this video. A roughing gouge can also be used to shape a spindle as it's turning. Here I'm making a woodcarver's mallet. The roughing gouge can also be used to make a spindle very smooth. To do that, you have to be very careful and take off just a little bit at a time. But when I'd stop the lathe at the end of this section, you can see how smooth that piece of wood really is. It's that smooth without using any sandpaper. Another important tool is a parting tool. I'm using a parting tool here to turn this piece down small enough so that a ferrule will fit over it. Here I'm using a parting tool to set the depth for the side of a bead. This is a common use for a parting tool. In this video segment, I'm using a parting tool to part off this ice cream scoop handle from the lathe, thus the name parting tool. I first turn the piece down to a small nub and then use the parting tool to actually part it off from the lathe as it was spinning. Here I'm using a slow speed so it doesn't go flying out of my hand. Another very useful tool is a spindle gouge. Here I'm using a spindle gouge to turn beads on both ends of this ice cream scoop handle. It's an easy tool to use, but like any turning tool, it can be a little tricky. It takes a lot of practice. You may notice as I turn the bead, I actually turn the tool as well. Since I got the small set of tools with my lathe, I decided to try to use one of them on this ice cream scoop handle. I decided to try the Skew Chisel. I'm turning a bead on the end of my ice cream scoop handle that I couldn't turn if I was using the Spindle Gouge. A Skew Chisel is one of those tools that you can get. Some people think they're very tricky and will catch easily and feel that they're a little more dangerous to use than the other tools. When used correctly, they're a great tool to have. One of the features that I like in a lathe, and is one of the reasons I bought this lathe, is this forward and reverse switch. If I turn the lathe on now, it's going forward. To put the lathe in reverse, I do have to turn it off first. Then I flip the forward and reverse switch. In the middle, there is a stopping position for safety. Now when I turn the lathe on, it's going in reverse. This is one of those features that I really like in a lathe. It's not available on many lathes. In my opinion, reversing the lathe has two advantages when it comes to sanding. First of all, I can place my hand on top of the piece rather than under the piece. I think it's a lot safer. I've also noticed that it sends the sanding dust away from me rather than into my face. Using the sandpaper, I go up to 600 grit. Here I've switched to strips of sandpaper that they sell for turning. I'm not sure if I like this better than my regular sandpaper though. It seems like it's a little more expensive. I'll have to consider that in the future, especially when I run out of the strips. The strips do go up to 600 grit. For things like ice cream scoop handles, I switch over to these micro mesh pads. They're 2 inches by 2 inches and go from 1500 grit to 12,000 grit. I really like them because they actually burnish the wood before the finish goes on. The end product is an extremely smooth piece of wood. This is what my Bacote ice cream scoop handles look like after using the pads. This is what I use to store my sanding pads when I use them on the lathe. It's real easy to use them because you can pull one out at the bottom, and when you use that one, you put it at the top, and the next grit is ready and available for you. This piece comes from Rocklear, and then I mounted it on an old piece of mahogany that I had sitting around. And then I put a magnet on the magnets on the very back of it, and you can see that those magnets attach it to a little piece of metal on the top of the Nova Comet II lathe. I made a video on this sanding station and some other sanding storage that I have. You might want to check that out. I also use the reverse function of the lathe for putting on finish. Here I'm putting on some finish with a paper towel while the lathe is in reverse. Just like with the sanding, this allows me to put the finish with my hand on top of the piece rather than trying to do it underneath the piece. Applying the finish while the lathe is turning adds friction to the process. That friction helps to polish the finish. I would be remiss in this video if I didn't mention the fact that face shields are a must for turning. Yes, you need to wear a face shield, not just depend on safety glasses. When you're working with a lathe, you have wood that's spinning at a high speed right towards you. And if it comes loose, it's going to come flying towards you. I've only had that happen once so far. Fortunately for me at the time, the piece flew away from me rather than towards me. But I was watching a podcast the other day, and a very seasoned turner was showing the scar that he had in his forehead. He wasn't wearing a safety shield, and a piece flew off the lathe and hit him right on the forehead and left a scar. The Nova Comet II is considered a midi lathe rather than a mini lathe. One of the reasons for that is the space between the center of the spindle and the ways of the lathe. But you also have to consider that the banjo sits above the ways of the lathe. So depending on how you're going to turn your bowl and the shape of your bowl, the size may be limited quite a bit more by the shape of the banjo. This banjo is fairly tall. There may be also a difference in the speed of the motor and the power of the motor. Those are all specs that you need to look at when you're looking at lathes and see what fits your needs. One thing to look at is the length of the lathe. The Nova Comet II is 23 inches from center to center. An extension is available that adds 16.5 inches to that. Of course, what you want to do on your lathe will determine the size of lathe that you need for what you want to do. I chose a midi lathe because I really like the features of the Nova Comet II, and the size really didn't make any difference. At this point in time, I don't plan on turning large objects like bowls or plates or platters. I'm planning on just turning spindles, and really mainly short spindles. So this lathe fits right into what I want it for. In the future, if I decide to turn larger bowls or other objects, obviously I'll have to upgrade at that time. And hopefully at that time I'll be able to afford something larger if that's what I plan to do. But you need to think about what you want to do and what size of lathe you need and what will fit into your budget. Here are some projects that I've turned so far. I have videos on these on my YouTube channel. You might want to check them out. Personally, I think the Nova Comet II is a very well-made piece of equipment. I haven't seen anything on it that I really didn't like, except for the plastic handles that you use for adjusting things like the tool rest. I'm not sure how long they're going to last. Well, that's my Nova Comet II lathe. I've really enjoyed using it. I'm looking forward to using it in the future and producing some more videos using it. I hope you like this video. If you like this video, please remember to give it a thumbs up down below. Ask any questions that you have or make comments. I really enjoy reading those, and thank you all very much for watching.